So, what is free software? It's software that respects the user's freedom and community. So when we say free, we're not talking about price. We're talking about freedom. So it's frei, not kostenlos. Well, it might be kostenlos also, but that's a minor practical detail. We're not concerned about that. We're not against paying or receiving money for a copy of a program. The question for us is, once you've got a copy, does it respect your freedom and your community, or does it treat you wrong? That's the important question. That's what we're concerned about. But what's a program? What is a computer? A computer is a universal computing device. But really, it's very simple. It only knows how to do one thing. Get the next instruction and do what that says. Get the next instruction and do what that says. Millions of times a second, get the next instruction and do what that says. The instructions come from a program. And depending on what instructions the program contains, it can make the computer do anything at all within the limits of what's possible. Some things the computer just can't do. So who gives the instructions to your computer? You might think it's you, when really it's someone else. You might think your computer obeys you, when really it's obeying its true master in first place, and it does what you ask for when the real master says it's okay. With any program, there are two possibilities. Either the users control the program, or the program controls the users. Those are the only possibilities, so it's always one or the other. When the users control the program, that's free software. Why so? Freedom means having control of your own life, control of the activities you do in your life. But if the activity is done with a program, then control of the activity requires having control of the program. So, when the users control the program, that program respects their freedom and also their community, and in a few minutes I'll explain about that. The practical, concrete criterion for a free program is that it gives users the four essential freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose. And freedom 1 is to study the program's source code and change it so that the program does your computing activity the way you wish. Why is source code essential here? Well, there's some source code. It's a mixture of English and math. If you've learned that programming language, you can read the source code, understand what it does, and change it to do something else. In order to run the program, we convert it into executable code, which is an enigmatic series of ones and zeros. It's not easy to understand what they mean. Now, if the program is this short, it's not really a big job. A programmer wouldn't have much trouble figuring out this tiny program in executable form. But for a typical program, which is tens or hundreds of thousands of lines of source code, figuring it out from the executable would be terribly hard. This job is called reverse engineering, and it's so hard that people only do it as a last recourse from desperation. So, to tell the users, you're free to change this program if you reverse engineer it and figure it out first, that's a mockery of freedom 1. It's not really respecting users' freedom to change the program. So, we must insist that the users get access to the source code, or it's not free software. These two freedoms give all the users separately control over the program, each user separately. Here we see 4 users using the same program. One of them over here is changing the source code, exercising freedom 1. The other 3 are using the program just as they got it. The point is that each one is free to change the program, but with freedoms 1 and 2 alone, they're limited to doing things separately. That's not separate control like this is essential, but it's not enough, because most users are not programmers. Most people use computing, but they're not software developers. They do other things. So how are they going to have control over their software and their computing? Through collective control. Collective control is the freedom to cooperate with other users in changing the software and making it do what you want it to do. So at the top we see a group of 3 users that are working together to change this program and make it do what they prefer. The 2 on the right are directly touching the code. They must be programmers. The one on the left is not touching the code. That user may not be a programmer, but still participates in exercising control over what that program does because they all discuss together what changes they want. This is the way a non-programmer can participate in control over what that program does. Those who cooperate in this way are those who choose to cooperate. Nobody is required to cooperate with anybody else. At the bottom we have 2 more users that are not involved in that group. They're using the program the way it was released. Why are they not cooperating? Well, there are many possible reasons. One is maybe those 2 don't know those 3. Another is maybe they don't like those 3, you don't trust them. Or maybe they trust those people just fine, but they have a different idea of what they want the program to do. Maybe they've looked at the version those 3 are making and said, I like the old version better. For whatever reason, they haven't chosen to cooperate, but they're free to do so. Maybe tomorrow those 2 will meet those 3 and they'll all start working together. Collective control requires 2 more essential freedoms. Freedom 2 is the freedom to make exact copies of the program and then give or sell them to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is the freedom to make copies of your modified versions and give or sell them to others when you wish. These 2 freedoms permit any group of users to cooperate when they wish, because when any one in this group makes a modified version, person is then free to make more copies of that version and redistribute them to others in the group. Then they, with freedom 2, are free to make more copies of that version and redistribute them to more people in the group. They're also free to offer copies of this version to others that are not in the group. For instance, to publish these versions, which means offering copies of them to everyone. And that's how the users together can control the program. So when the program carries the 4 essential freedoms, and each freedom is complete and adequate, then it's free software. Let me repeat those 4 freedoms because they're important. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish for whatever purpose. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code and change it to make the program do your computing activities the way you wish. Freedom 2 is to make exact copies and give or sell them to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is to make copies of your modified versions and give or sell them to others when you wish. So if the program comes with these 4 freedoms, then the users control the program, so it's free software and respects their freedom and community. But if any of these freedoms is missing or incomplete, then the users don't fully control the program. Instead, the program controls the users, and the proprietor of this proprietary program controls the program. So this program is an instrument for the proprietor to control the users. It's an instrument of unjust power. It generates a system of unjust power. This is why any non-free program is an injustice. It's an injustice to those who are using it. Many people misunderstand and they think that I disapprove of people for using a non-free program. No, I disapprove of the developers that subjugate users through the non-free program. The users I just feel sorry for. The users are the victims. I hope you will escape. Anyway, this is the primary injustice of proprietary or non-free software. But it tends to lead to other injustices, because nowadays the proprietary developers are fully aware of the power they exercise over the users. Often they develop the program in order to lure some users under their power. The power is what they want, and the power corrupts them. They feel the temptation to take advantage of that power to mistreat the users further by putting malicious functionalities into the program. And they can do that, and if they do, nobody can stop them, and the users have no defense against it. For instance, often they spy on users. This is one example. This is Amazon's ebook reader, the Amazon Swindle, which swindles readers out of all the traditional freedoms of readers of books. In particular, it does Orwellian surveillance of the users. Every so often, the device sends the title of the book being read to an Amazon server, and it will send the page number also. Even if the book was not obtained from Amazon, Amazon knows the user is reading it. Also, if the user enters any notes, they're sent to Amazon. Highlight any text, sent to Amazon. So it's complete Orwellian surveillance of everything the user does. But this product is not unusual. All the proprietary operating systems spy on the users. Windows, Mac OS, iOS, they all spy on the user, sending personal data to a company. Flash Player helps websites track the user. And then there are many apps that spy on users. Even flashlight apps. All it's supposed to do is light up the screen. So why is it sending messages to a bunch of different websites? There's only one possible reason, and that's spying on the user. The job it's supposed to do doesn't require any communication with anyone. And then there are the products and apps that are tied to a particular server. Well, if they can determine who the user is, they're almost always spying on the user. Here's the Fitbit. The Fitbit collects personal data and sends it to a company. Then the company offers to sell that data to the user it's about. But I believe it sells the same data to other companies too, without the user's name. So the other company, if it's a data broker, correlates that data with a bunch of other data and figures out who it is. So that means the data, which was anonymized, is now re-identified. And since that data broker has no contract with the user, it can easily sell this data, even with the name, to anybody at all. It's the same with the streaming apps, such as Spotify and Netflix. They make the user identify herself. I should explain, I'm using the gender-neutral third-person singular pronouns, person, per, and pers. I cannot stand the use of they as a singular pronoun. It's frequently confusing, so I'm against it. I prefer to use these three elegant pronouns. I hope you'll join me. So, for instance, Spotify makes the user identify herself in order to pay. And then Spotify keeps track of what person listens to. So that's total tracking of what songs that user listens to. Shouldn't be done. So I say, out, damn Spotify. There are other nasty things that Spotify does. It makes users agree to an end user license agreement that includes, for instance, a commitment not to give or lend a copy to anyone else. Now, such conditions are antisocial. It's wrong to agree. And if you have agreed, it's even more wrong if you did what the antisocial things you promised to do. So, making an antisocial promise is no excuse for being antisocial afterwards. But the best thing is never to agree to an end-user license agreement. I've been careful about these for a long, long time. I have never knowingly agreed to one. Never. See, I know that I'm going to be willing to lend copies, give copies, and also copy and share, and therefore I don't want to promise. I don't want to make a promise that I know I would consider wrong to keep, so I don't. Netflix is it's just as nasty, but actually it goes a little further in nastiness. So I would never consider using Netflix. In fact, I find them so odious that I won't even listen to music or watch a screen on which is playing through Spotify or Netflix or anything similar. And then there are the transportation company apps. Companies like Uber and Lyft require users to run non-free software in order to ask for a ride, and then they have to identify themselves in order to pay, which means that the company tracks where a person goes. This is extremely dangerous, not just to individuals, because, well, some employees of Uber once decided to see who was having a one-night stand. It wasn't hard to identify. And at one point, there were a number of things that they can do with the data that they collect. They shouldn't be collecting that data. These rides should be anonymous. And you'll, of course, notice lots more proprietary apps that track people. I would never give my name to any of these things. But I also wouldn't run them because I won't have proprietary software running on my computer. Now, some of these apps, they say are free, but what they mean is kostenlos. None of these apps are free. They don't respect users' freedom. So that's the first thing, the first sign that you shouldn't run. Another kind of malicious functionality is digital restrictions management, DRM, also known as digital handcuffs. That's when the program is designed to restrict users, to control what users can do and stop them from doing what the proprietor doesn't like. And this is the most directly malicious functionality that we can think of, because it explicitly says, I'm going to stop you from doing what you want. Those programs are not our servants, they're our prison guards. So the thought of using one makes me so angry that I would never consider doing it. Now, this example is the Blu-ray disc. They did years of work to design them to stop users from ever being able to access the data on the disc except under the power of the makers of the disc and the format. And they have been partly defeated. There is some free software you can use to play a Blu-ray disc. It's not apparently very convenient to set it up, but you can. Maybe it's easier for me to continue my policy of never using a Blu-ray disc. There's simply no movie I want so much that I would give up my freedom to watch it. But you can find the base for implementing DRM in proprietary operating systems such as Windows, Mac OS, iOS, and Android. And then you find DRM in Flash Player and in the Amazon Swindle and in lots of apps. But moving on, there are also backdoors. A backdoor is a functionality that accepts commands from somebody, commands to do something or other to the users. Something that the user might not like, but the user is not asked. The user does not have a chance to say, no, don't do this to me. It doesn't even inform the user, typically. It's hard to tell when a program has a backdoor. There's no way to analyze it and find out. The only way we find out is if we're lucky or unlucky enough. Books. We know about this because in 2009, Amazon remotely erased thousands of copies of a particular book in a large Orwellian act. Users saw this happening. In fact, some of them saw the book disappear as they were reading it. And what was the book, the object of this Orwellian act? It was 1984 by George Orwell. So this provoked a lot of criticism. To remove the momentum from the criticism, Amazon said it would never do this again unless ordered to by the state. If you've read 1984, that might not be very comforting. But it doesn't matter because that wasn't a real, sincere promise. That was just some noise to make to weaken the criticism. A few years later, Amazon went back to remotely erasing books without even an order from the state. Now, we also know that the iThings, Apple's mobile monsters, have a backdoor for remotely erasing apps. Apple can remotely erase any app at any time. And in Android, it's an even bigger backdoor. In Google Play, which is one of the proprietary components of Android, there's a backdoor that can either forcibly erase an app or forcibly install an app. So Google could make a special app just for you and then force your phone to install it. What fun. Then there's censorship. The iPhone was the first general-purpose computer designed for censorship of apps. In other words, users were not allowed to install freely the applications of their choice. They could only install the applications approved by Apple and placed in the App Store. Apple practices this censorship arbitrarily according to its commercial interests and its politics. Microsoft implemented similar censorship when it saw that people accepted the censorship by Apple. When the users found ways to get around the censorship, they called it jailbreaking, saying in effect that that system was a jail. So that's our term for systems that do this. They're jails. Now, some backdoors are so powerful they can do literally anything to the poor user. We call them universal backdoors. They're universal in the same way a computer is. The same computer will do any computation if it's given a program that describes how to do that computation. In the same sense, the backdoor can make that system do anything whatsoever by remotely installing the code to do that thing. Windows has a universal backdoor, so Microsoft can do absolutely anything to the poor user of Windows. This universal backdoor was first detected in Windows XP. Microsoft declined to acknowledge that there was a universal backdoor, but people had demonstrated it. But some years later, in Windows 7, Microsoft proudly announced the presence of a universal backdoor, giving it a nice sounding name. It's called Auto Upgrade, or depending on your point of view, you might call it Auto Downgrade. But the point is, Microsoft now admits it has the power to forcibly change the software in any way whatsoever, which is the biggest security hole there could ever be. Now, there's also a universal backdoor in the Amazon swindle, and nearly every portable phone model has a universal backdoor. And this has been used and is used regularly to convert portable phones into listening devices that listen all the time and transmit all the conversation they hear. And you don't have to speak directly into the microphone either. If there's a conversation in the same room, the phone can hear it and transmit it. If you're thinking of getting your privacy back by turning the phone off, surprise, there's no off switch. Instead, there's a button that says, "Oh, sir, telephone, would you please turn yourself off?" But once the phone has been converted in this way, it says, "Oh, of course," and then it pretends to shut off, but it keeps on running and listening and transmitting all the time. The only way to stop it is to remove all the batteries. All the batteries, but many models have a battery that can't be removed. Maybe it has one that can be removed and another that can't be. When you put this together with another form of mistreatment of portable phones, namely that the phone system always knows where the phone is, and it can know that even without the phone's cooperation, just by triangulation on the signals that the phone sends from time to time, saying, "Here I am." What we get is that a portable phone is Stalin's dream. If Stalin could have given everybody in the Soviet Union a device that would report where that person goes all the time and could be used to listen to all the conversations around that person, Stalin would have been delighted. But the technology didn't exist. Poor Stalin. Unfortunately, that technology does now exist, and billions of people have been lured into carrying such devices. But not me. I was lucky. I had the good fortune that when I first considered whether I wanted to carry a portable phone, I asked around and I found out about these nasty things. And then it was clear to me that I couldn't even imagine carrying such a thing. It was my duty as a citizen not to give in to these portable phones. So I don't have one. I never did. But I do occasionally use portable phones. They're not mine, of course. And usually I use each one only once. So if I'm in a bus and I want to let somebody know when it will arrive, I can ask somebody else to call for me or send a text for me. That gets the information through and doesn't tell Big Brother much about me. It can actually even get nastier. This is not exactly a malicious functionality. It's not a functionality at all. It's a practice. When Microsoft learns about a security fault in Windows, before fixing it, it shows the fault to the NSA. So the NSA can use it to break into computers. In other words, Microsoft directly betrays all its clients. Do you think any level of German government should use Windows? Obviously not. But we don't know that other companies don't do the same thing. We have this evidence only about Microsoft. For all the other companies, there is an absence of evidence, which is not evidence of absence. Maybe the other companies, each one might do the same thing, or it might not, and we can't tell. So these are a bunch of malicious functionalities, but we know a lot more of them. We have around 150 examples listed in gnu.org/proprietary. What these examples show, even the ones I've told you by themselves, show that most users of proprietary software are victims of proprietary malware, because most of them are using one of the programs I've just mentioned. I've proved to you that most users of proprietary software are victims of malware. But let me explain what malware means. Malware means a program designed to run in a way that hurts the user. So it's all about what the program does when it runs. By contrast, proprietary software is software distributed in a way that disrespects the user's freedom and community. This is only about how the program is made available for use. It's not about what's inside the program at all, not directly. So, at the philosophical level, proprietary and malware are completely orthogonal, unrelated issues. But in practice, they tend to go together, because when a program is proprietary, its developer is tempted to make it malware. And that's why so many of the proprietary programs you heard of are malware. Now, why do they do this? For profit. They've discovered ways to profit more at the expense of their users by mistreating them. So, I've given you a few examples, but there are thousands of other proprietary programs, and for most of them we don't know anything. We don't know if they have malicious functionalities or not. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. I'm sure there are some proprietary programs that have no malicious functionalities, but we can't identify one, because we can never verify that there are no malicious functionalities. We can't study the source code. The developer won't let us. So we can never assure that a given proprietary program is not malware. So every proprietary program is either known, demonstrated malware, or it's possible malware. Those are the two possible situations for a proprietary program. Either we know it's malware or it might be malware. But you can never be sure it's not malware. Which means that using a proprietary program requires blind faith. You can never rationally trust it. You can only decide to ignore the fact that you can't rationally trust it. And often, it's blind faith in a company that has already mistreated users, so you know it doesn't deserve any faith. What it comes down to is, using proprietary software is asking to be taken. If you want a rational basis to trust a program, it has to be free software. You see, with free software, the users have a defense. It's the only known defense against malware for the program to be free, because that means the users control the program. The users can check what's in the code, and the users can change it. So we, contributors, we know that we don't have power over the users, and that protects us from being corrupted. No power, not corrupted. We don't face the temptation to abuse the power we don't have. Now, this defense is not perfect. It's not guaranteed. But it's a lot better than being defenseless, which is what proprietary software users are. Proprietary software users are at the mercy of the proprietor. Users of free software have a defense. So, instead of using proprietary software, I hope you will escape and come live in the free world that we have built. With the GNU operating system and the Linux kernel, we made it possible to use a computer in freedom. I started developing GNU in 1984. I said, I'm going to make it possible to use a computer in freedom by writing a complete Unix-compatible operating system that is 100% made of free software. Because that's what you need to run a computer in freedom. You have to have all the software being free. If there's a non-free program, it's attacking your freedom. So we needed a complete operating system made of free software. By 1990, that was almost done. The GNU system was almost complete, but one essential component, the kernel, was missing. In 1990, we started developing a kernel called the GNU Herd. The Free Software Foundation hired somebody to write it. But I chose a design perhaps too elegant and advanced, which appears to have turned it into a research project. It took 6 years to have a test release, which is sad. But fortunately, we didn't have to wait for that. In 1991, Mr. Torvalds started writing a kernel called Linux. In 91, Linux was not free software. It was under a license that was too restrictive. It did not fully grant freedoms 2 and 3 because it did not permit commercial redistribution. But in 92, he liberated the code of Linux by releasing it under one of the free software licenses, specifically the GNU General Public License, or GNU GPL. And that made Linux free software, so it could fill the last gap in GNU, and we had the GNU/Linux operating system. For the first time, you could run a PC in freedom. Now, I'm sure you've heard people talk about this combination and call it Linux, which is basically attributing our work to Mr. Torvalds and giving us none of the credit, which is not fair to us. Please don't do that. Please give us equal mention by calling it GNU/Linux or GNU+Linux. Since we started this, and since we did the biggest single contribution to the system, I think it's fair to ask for equal mention for us. Now, in principle, GNU/Linux is free software, but in practice, often it's not. You see, there are thousands of different distributions or distros of gnu/linux, each one with its own developers, and they decide which programs to add to their distro. And they may add free programs, which is great, but they may also add a non-free program. And that's a big problem because it means that their distro is not a free operating system. Well, there are thousands of distros that are non-free and around 10 that are free. For more specifics, look at gnu.org/distros. The non-free distros mean that if you just decide to install gnu/linux and you pick a distro that people are talking about, it's probably one of those, which means you will come closer to freedom, but you won't get all the way there. You'll stop a certain distance away from freedom, and you may not even know this. Now, it's better to use a non-free distro, such as Ubuntu, than to run Windows or Mac OS. At least with the non-free gnu/linux distro, you come most of the way to freedom. The problem is you don't get all the way there, and it doesn't tell you about that, probably. How do you teach people values? By incorporating those values in your actions and your words. Well, the actions of Ubuntu are installing non-free programs. And when you look at the developers' words, you see that they don't talk about freedom at all. They could say, you deserve freedom in your computing and you won't get it from us. Obviously, they don't want to say that. It's true, but they don't say it. Instead, they say, we aim to give you the best possible user experience. So they're teaching people to value convenience only. They're working directly against our efforts to teach people to value freedom. So at that level, their efforts are an obstacle. And they have a lot of influence. I'm just looking at your hat, which seems interesting. Does it mean anything in particular, or is it just pretty?
Nothing special.
Okay. So the only distros we recommend are the free ones. Now, how do you make a program free software? Under today's badly designed copyright law, every work that's written is automatically copyrighted. So every program is automatically copyrighted, and copyright law by default forbids people to make more copies, to redistribute those copies, to make changes, and in some countries, in some places, and in some cases, even running the program is forbidden, because running it requires copying it into memory, and maybe that act of copying is forbidden. Depends on the country. So this law is pretty bad, but we're stuck with it until someday we could change it. It's made to be this way by the Berne Convention. I once led a protest in Bern against the Berne Convention. And then the World Trade Organization, a thoroughly vicious organization that is responsible for patenting some people to death, demands this bad copyright law. For many reasons, we have to get rid of the World Trade Organization. It's also a so-called free trade treaty, unquote, which really means giving more power to businesses and taking the power away from governments that can be democratic, so that they won't really have any power to do much that's democratic. Anyway, how do you make a program free? The copyright holders have to make a formal declaration giving the 4 freedoms to any user that has a copy of the program. That's what gives users the 4 freedoms. Now, the text of this license has to be written adequately. Don't try to write one yourself. If you don't want to mess it up, you have to work with lawyers. With GPL version 3, I worked with an international team of lawyers set up by Eben Moblin, and they made sure that the license would do the same thing in all the countries they could check. In any case, a program with no license is non-free. So tell the developer, please make your program free. You need to put a license on it. Don't be careless about showing what freedoms the users have. That's the most important thing in the program. There needs to be a copy of the license in the program for clarity's sake. And then each source file should have a notice saying, this whole program is under the such and such license, see that file. And this way, the code is unlikely to get separated from its license, which would cause legal confusion. Also, when you're using the GNU General Public License, that notice is the one that says which license versions users can choose from. So that notice has to be there. If it's not there, things are ambiguous. There are many different free software licenses. Any statement that ends up giving the users the 4 freedoms is a free software license. So they can vary in not just in wording, but in effect. But there are 2 main categories of free licenses. There are the lax permissive licenses or weak licenses and the copyleft licenses. The weak licenses say, do whatever you like with this code, just keep my name on it. And the problem is that it's too nice. It doesn't know how to say no to hurting other people. In particular, it permits a company to take all the code of that program and copy it into a proprietary software product. So this happened, for instance, with Apache. Apache is free software released under a lax permissive license, the Apache license version 2. So if you get that version, it's free software. There's nothing wrong with it. But IBM made a proprietary modified version. And it was permitted to do so because the license of Apache is weak. But the users of that version, they don't get freedom. So IBM is using that code to subjugate these users. That's a bad outcome. Well, fortunately, I had seen an instance of this problem before I released the first piece of useful GNU software. So I knew that this could happen unless I found a way to stop it. So I invented copyleft, which is the way to stop it. The idea of copyleft is to put a condition on redistribution. So a copyleft license gives users freedoms 2 and 3, but with a condition that says, when you redistribute a copy, with or without changes and extensions, the whole program, as you distribute it, must be covered by the same license, and you must provide the whole source code to the users. In other words, the middleman must pass on to the users of per version the same freedoms that person got from us. So the freedoms have to go with the program wherever it goes. Every copy of every version of the program carries these freedoms. That's copyleft, which is implemented in the GNU General Public License, as well as some other licenses. There are other copyleft licenses too. The GNU GPL says no when it should. It says, okay, IBM, you're welcome to contribute to the free version, but you can't make a proprietary version. And lo and behold, IBM contributes. to free versions of programs under the GPL. If a company wants to make a certain modified version available, but it's not permitted to make that proprietary, the only way it can do so is by making it free. And the next thing the company's managers realize is, instead of releasing their own modified version, they're probably better off cooperating with the developers of the principal version and getting their changes in there. So they often do. Now, if you have written a program or changes to a free program and you want to make that free, look at gnu.org/licenses/license-recommendations.html. You'll see what we recommend for various situations, and it's not always the same. And that directory, gnu.org/licenses, has a lot of information about which licenses are free, which things are good or bad about them, and how to use them, etc. Now, once all the software in your computer is free, you may still find yourself running non-free software if you're not careful. Because nowadays, web pages often contain JavaScript code, and these programs may be free or not, just like any programs. If it comes as source code and it carries a free license, it's free software. Some of them are free software, but most of them are not. We didn't want to run those non-free programs, so we developed LibreJS, which is an add-on for Firefox that analyzes the JavaScript programs in the web pages to see if they are either free or trivial. And if they're free or trivial, they're allowed to run. But when it finds a non-trivial, non-free program, it blocks that. And you can find out on the screen whether there are any blocked programs in the current page. LibreJS does one other thing. It searches heuristically through the website to find complain quickly. Because it's very important to complain. It will give you a place to click, and then you enter, "I couldn't use your site because it tried to make me run non-free JavaScript. Please fix that." Send. In less than a minute, you can complain. In 10 minutes a day, you could complain to 10 different sites. Please do that. We need to send them a lot of complaints to pressure them to fix this. Well, beyond this, there's another way you could lose control of your computing activity. It's called SaaS, Service as a Software Substitute. And what this means is a service offers to do your computing activity for you, so that instead of running a program on your computer, you would let the service do it. And that means you lose control over it. You can have control over a program running on your computer if it's free software, but you can never have control over what the service does. It's run by somebody else. So automatically, entrusting any computing activity of yours to a service run by someone else means you lose control over that computing activity, which is mistreatment of you. It takes away your freedom. So, for your freedom's sake, you've got to say no to this. It's equivalent to running a non-free program to do that computing activity. But actually, it's even worse. I explained that many non-free programs spy on the user. They send personal data to some server. Well, to use SaaS, the user has to give all the pertinent data to the server. So it's the same result. It's as if a non-free program were spying on that user, sending the data to the server. But it's even worse. As I explained, some non-free programs contain a universal backdoor, which means somebody has the power to change the code remotely and thus change how the user's computing gets done without asking that user for permission to change it. Well, with SAS, the server owner at any time could put different software into the server, and should be free to do so, right? It's per computer. A person should be free to put different software in and change those programs too. If they're free, then a person can change those programs. That's good. The bad part happens because that server is not doing per computing. Instead, it's doing other people's computing. So that gives per the power to change how those other people's computing is done without asking them for permission to change it. So using SAS is equivalent to using a proprietary program which spies on the user and has a universal backdoor. For your freedom's sake, say no to it. So we want freedom, but there are obstacles in the way. One of them is social inertia. The companies that subjugate people collect lots of money from this. Then they often use that money to change the situation to make it harder for people to escape. That's called social inertia. But social inertia also sometimes arises naturally. Sometimes it happens naturally, sometimes it's artificially created. But either way, it's a class of obstacles that are very important. For instance, there's the network effect. The network effect is that when a communication system is widely used, that pressures people to use it. Consider, for instance, Skype. Lots of people use Skype. It's a proprietary program, and it's designed to spy on people. So it's not a good thing. But people say, I have to use Skype. My relatives, my friends, my coworkers insist I use Skype. So they use it, and that means they're victims in the first place. But then, by using it, they become part of the pressure that falls on other people, pressuring them to use Skype. So the users of Skype are victim co-perpetrators. And this means you have not only that you deserve to reject it, but it's your duty to reject it, because it's wrong for you to become part of the pressure on other people to use Skype. This is why I won't talk to anyone through Skype, even if it's running on someone else's computer. Because I don't want to be contributing to the social inertia that keeps people using Skype. And this shows us something. It often looks hopeless to resist social inertia. But we can resist it. What it takes is force of will, firmness. But it is possible. And enough of us exercising firmness of will, we can surmount the social inertia. It can be done. Don't give up. Wow. That seems to have been a response to what I said. What's happening? Is somebody leaning on a switch? Please turn the lights back on. Thank you. It's funny how they go in a wave around the room. Another example of social inertia is lots of schools teach Windows and lots of companies use Windows. And when you ask the schools to please stop teaching Windows, they say, well, the companies use Windows. We have to teach students what the companies want. And when you ask the companies to stop using Windows, they say, well, the schools graduate Windows users, we need to use what the schools teach. So the schools and the companies are waiting for each other, each one saying, we can't change till the other one does. That's another form of social inertia. And how do we surmount this? The schools must change. It's wrong to say that the schools have to teach a form of pernicious dependence merely because the rest of society is in that pit at the moment. It's the school's job to teach something better than that dependence. And note that often the company responsible, in this case Microsoft, is the cause of that social inertia. Microsoft does quite a lot to pressure schools to teach Windows. So here you start to see how companies specifically create the inertia, the obstacles to escaping. And speaking of Microsoft, another form of social inertia is that Microsoft pressured PC manufacturers to agree to pay for a Windows license for each machine sold, even if the user didn't want one. Such contracts ought to be legally invalid or maybe even criminal, but they're not. Governments mostly let Microsoft get away with this abuse of its market position. Oh, and by the way, that's not all Microsoft does to stop people from escaping. You probably heard several years ago that Munich had switched to gnu+linux. Well, Munich is about to vote to switch back to Windows, and we have to suspect the reason is that Microsoft made a payment to Munich by moving its European headquarters there. And this illustrates an interesting point. To pay a bribe to a politician is a crime, but paying a bribe to a government is not a crime. You know, it wasn't a crime, even as far as I know, even if Microsoft had openly said, we'll move our headquarters to Munich if Munich switches to Windows, as far as I know, that would not be a crime. But it is, morally speaking, corruption, even if it's not illegal. So those politicians may not have committed any crime, but they deserve to be despised for their corruption. And so when these companies appear, when they're selling something or recruiting employees, they deserve protests. By the way, Apple also makes efforts to push schools to make students use Mac OS. And it's just as bad when Apple does it as when Microsoft does it. What's the problem? Don't turn the... Oh, no, you can't see. We need less light over here, but we need still have light on the audience to keep me awake. Another obstacle is the term open source. The term open source was coined in 1998 as a way of co-opting our software and causing our ideals to be forgotten. They wanted to talk about our software and cover up entirely the idea it's about freedom. So, they started using this term, open source, that had not been used before. And that meant they could design a new form of discourse to talk about it, which didn't refer to any issues of right and wrong. Because above all, they did not want to say proprietary software is an injustice. That's the point they wanted to cause everyone to forget. So where we say, we base our statements on the values of freedom and community. So we say, if you develop and distribute a program, it's your moral duty to let the users change it and redistribute it. But the open source supporters would never say anything like that. They don't want to talk about any kind of moral duty for those that develop software. So instead they say, if you develop and distribute a program, you can do what you like, but it might be in your practical interest to let the users change it and redistribute it, because then they'll improve the code quality. Contrast these two different philosophies. We say the users deserve freedom and respect for their community. The open source people won't say anything like that. The most they will say to developers is, it might be in your interest to do this. And if a developer says, we've decided it's not in our interest, then the open source people have no objection left. So, unfortunately, in 1998, most people in the community held the open source type of view, and they mostly switched to that term. Almost all the businesses in the community switched to the term open source, and so the politicians and the journalists followed them. And since then, the mainstream media and the tech press almost always talk about open source. They don't mention free software. In fact, the misinformation associating us with open source has spread so far that a large fraction of our community has no idea that we have different views that are different from open source. Most people who have heard of me and my work think I'm an open source supporter. Every week I get messages from people raising a question about open source with me, asking me to speak about what's good about open source, thanking me for my work on open source. I have to teach them that that's not what I do. I have to be very careful to respond in a way that's sharp enough that they notice that they were mistaken, but not so sharp that it hurts their feelings and makes them hate me. It's not the easiest thing in the world to avoid both of these problems. Even worse, I've seen articles that called me the father of open source. What can I do? I send a letter to the editor saying, if I'm the father of open source, it was conceived through artificial insemination using stolen sperm without my knowledge or consent. Then I explain what free software means and about the free software movement and so on, and its philosophy. That's the serious part of the letter, but it's fun to start with a joke. Now, the problem caused by open source is that we have to work very hard to show people that the free software movement exists. People think that we support an imaginary open source movement. There never was an open source movement. The whole point of open source was not to be a movement. They're not campaigning to right any wrongs. They don't want to recognize there is a wrong. So we need your help. You can help us a lot simply by saying freie Software. Or if you're speaking English, say free software or free libre software. The point is, don't say open source and don't say closed source. Because if you say those, you're basically boosting the open source idea. But let me make this clear. You have a right to do that if that's what you want to say. You can say it. If you agree with open source, well, you have a right to support it. But if you agree with the free software movement, please don't support open source instead. Please show people you support us. And this becomes especially important if you're in a discussion where other people are talking about open source and judging the issue purely according to practical convenience. Then you can say, well, this is not an issue of open source, this is an issue of free software. There are issues of justice and freedom at stake here. We should do it this way because this will respect people's freedom. In fact, we have to do it this way. It would be wrong not to do it this way. And even if you don't win the dispute, you have done good because you have educated all the people reading the list. There are probably 10 times as many lurkers as there are people contributing to the discussion. It's hard, if somebody's convinced that he's against you, it's hard to change the person's mind, but it's not hard to show other people what you think, and maybe that will win support from them. And give people links on gnu.org, that'll help too. Another obstacle is when the specs of the hardware are secret. So the manufacturer wants to sell you this physical product and refuses to tell you how to run it. Instead, it says, here's a program, proprietary of course, to run this hardware. Use it and shut up. But we can't use that program. We won't install it in our computers. So what can we do? We need reverse engineering. We need somebody very clever to study how that proprietary program interacts with the hardware to figure out the commands of the hardware, and then write them down and hand them to somebody else who can write a free program to run the hardware. That part is not so hard. We have lots of people who can do that. The reverse engineering is what we really need. Yeah, I see we do need, we need it to be darker here, but still light in the back. If you can figure out how to do it, please do. So if you want to make a big technical contribution, it seems to be getting better. And it's still sort of like, at least on the back wall. It's more visible than it was.
There's no distinguishing between here and there.
Well, I guess this might be the best compromise. So if you want to make an important technical contribution, do reverse engineering. But if you want to make a really important contribution, spread the free software philosophy. We really need that. So, schools should teach exclusively free software. And this applies to all levels of schools from kindergarten to university and to adult education. And when I say teach exclusively free software, I'm not talking only about giving formal lessons in using a certain program. I'm talking about any program that the school brings to the students for them to use, or directs them to use, or leads them to use. It should only lead them to use free software. Because the school has a social mission to educate good citizens of a society that is strong, capable, independent, cooperating, and free. And in computing, this means teaching people to use free software so that they are ready to be good citizens of such a society. And the school shouldn't do this as a mysterious, arbitrary, unexplained policy coming from somebody above. No, the school should explain exactly why it has this policy. And it should never teach a non-free program, because that is implanting dependence in society, not dependence on the rest of society, which of course is normal, but rather dependence on one particular entity, which is socially abusive. To teach people to run a non-free program is like teaching them to smoke tobacco. Never should a school do this. But there's also moral education. Schools need to teach people to be helpful members of society that help other people. So every class should have this rule. Students, if you bring software to class, you may not keep it for yourself. You must share copies with the rest of the class, including the source code in case someone here wants to learn, because this class is a place where we share our knowledge. Therefore, it's not permitted to bring a non-free program to this class, except to do reverse engineering on it. The school, to set a good example, must follow its own rule. It must bring only free software to class and share copies, including source code, with everyone that wants copies, except for the exercises for reverse engineering. Now, I'm told that this university doesn't have an information technology subject. So maybe this university wouldn't teach reverse engineering. But places where they do teach computer science and software, they should have classes in reverse engineering. It's not only necessary to advance freedom, it's also a very lucrative professional career. Why isn't the university helping people go into that career? But there's also a matter of education in programming. And this begins in high schools. That's where some people who are talented in programming need this opportunity. You see, every program embodies knowledge. If it's proprietary, that knowledge is secret. The program withholds the knowledge from the students. So it's the enemy of the spirit of education and should not be tolerated in a school. But a free program offers its knowledge to the students. The only excuse to allow a non-free program in a school should be for reverse engineering, which is the way you expose the knowledge that the program is trying to conceal. So how do you learn to write good, clear code? You do it by reading lots of code and writing lots of code. But only free software gives you the chance to read the code of large programs that we really use. Then you've got to write lots of code. If you want to learn to write good code for large programs, you have to write lots of code for large programs. But only free software gives you the chance to write changes for large programs we really use. Any school can offer students the chance to master the craft of programming if it is a free software school, as they all should be. So if you have a relationship with a school, if you are a student or a teacher or an administrator or an employee or the parent of a student, it's your responsibility to organize and campaign and pressure that school to move to free software. To teach a non-free program is to implant dependence. Parents should demand that their schools not teach, that their children's schools not teach those children to be bad members of society and refuse to share and be dependent. It's harmful. Human rights depend on each other. If we lose one human right, it becomes hard to defend the others. Well, now that we use computing for so many important activities, free software, in other words, control of our computing, has become one of the essential human rights we need in order to defend the others. And sometimes this requires a sacrifice. Defending your freedom sometimes requires a sacrifice. There's nothing new about that. Fortunately, in this field, they're not usually big sacrifices. They're small sacrifices of convenience, and that's all. But you still find people who show no sign of valuing freedom, who won't make even the tiniest sacrifice for their freedom, and they say so. People have told me, I'm perfectly happy with this proprietary program, but if you show me a program, a free program, which is 100% as convenient, powerful, fast, reliable, etc., then I'll switch. What they're actually saying is that for them, the value of freedom is exactly 0, because that's the size of sacrifice that they're willing to make for their freedom. And there's nothing I could do to make them change their minds, but I can cite them to you as examples of foolishness. The fool and his freedom are soon parted. If you want to have freedom, you've got to be ready to give up some convenience or some practical something when it's necessary. So how do you help our cause? Well, if you're a good programmer, write free software. I suggest you participate in 15 projects run by others before you start your own. That way you'll learn how to do a good job of running your own project. But if you're not a good programmer, do something else. Don't assume that you've got to struggle to be a programmer in order to help our cause. For instance, you can organize the movement's activities. You could become a speaker. If you don't know how to give good speeches, you can learn. For instance, there's an organization called Toastmasters where people go to learn to do public speaking. But if you don't want to take such a visible role, you could be the person who keeps the organization running, the person who maintains the mailing list and works out when there should be activities and finds speakers for them, or figures out what to do and informs people and so on. You can persuade schools and governments to move to free software. I already explained the reasons for schools. Look at gnu.org/edu. A responsibility to use only free software. And that is, the state exists for the people, and whatever it does for the people. Every state agency exists for the people. And all the computing it does, it's doing for the people. And it has a duty to the people to maintain its full control over that computing to assure it's done properly for the people. And that includes using only free software. Because if it uses a non-free program, it has lost control of its computing. Now, if you lose control of your computing, that's unfortunate for you. I would say, I'm sorry to hear it. I hope that you recover that control by not using that proprietary program anymore. But if a state agency loses control of its computing, that is failure of its responsibility to the people. It's not the state agency that loses, it's the people that lose. This is something that must be corrected. This is something that Munich is about to do again that has to be corrected. So look at gnu.org/government for the specific policies that we recommend to move the government to free software, which is not a simple thing to do. That's why we have to give recommendations about how to do it. If you're experienced at using gnu/linux, help other users. Start a gnu/linux user group or join an existing one. Or if there is a gnu/linux user group that calls itself a Linux user group, you can participate but teach people why that name is unfair and they should change it. And the most basic thing of all is to say free software whenever it's pertinent, rather than a term associated with an amoral attitude such as open source. There are other ways to help. I couldn't put them all into this talk. Look at gnu.org/help for lists of more ways to help. There's also gnu.org/philosophy with many articles about philosophical questions relating to free software. And there's gnu.org/gnu, which describes the history. Now, I promised to talk about privacy here too. Privacy in free software as issues overlap to some extent because proprietary software is likely to snoop on people, and then using the, there are many programs that are tied to a particular service, and those tend to snoop on people too. The service probably makes people identify themselves, and so it's all snooping. And there, we have a remedy. We could personally refuse to use those non-free programs and refuse to use those disservices. But there are other kinds of snooping that we can't personally stop. For instance, ISPs, due to an unjust European directive, record what websites people visit. And not just people who are somehow suspects, but everyone. Everyone is treated as a suspect. Now, we can't make them stop. What we can do to resist this, well, I do a couple of things. I never identify myself to log into the network, and I always connect through Tor. So it's hard for them to tell that it's me or what I'm connecting to. So here there's free software that helps us preserve our privacy, but the fundamental problem we are not in a position to fix directly because it's in a system we use, but it doesn't belong to us. And then phone systems keep track of people's phone calls and the messages they send or receive. To some extent, there's nothing we can do about that except organize politically and say our freedom must be respected. And then there are, paying with a credit card identifies you. So when I buy things, I pay cash in a physical store. Or occasionally, someone else who will buy it for me. Someone who doesn't mind being tracked like this and does it all the time. Because it would be wrong for me to urge a person to be tracked who normally resists it. So I only ask people who don't object and who don't think of resisting on their own behalf. I ask, would you please buy this for me, and then I'll buy it from you. For many years now, I have not used my credit card with anything but an airline. If I rented a car, I would use it for that. Because those activities demand people's identification anyway. Since I can't fly without their having my name, I don't lose anything by paying with a credit card. I think it's wrong for domestic flights to ask a person's name. It's especially bad for trains to do so. When they ask, I generally give some other name. So, when they put face recognition cameras or license plate recognition cameras in the street, that's a system of surveillance that's hard for us to resist. Face recognition doesn't work all that well yet, but license plate recognition is very effective. The problem is that those cameras recognize all the cars that pass by. They take down tracking information about everybody, not just suspects. So in order to reduce massive surveillance, license plate recognizers should be designed so they only recognize the license plates that are on a list of cars that are being sought, or if they are invalid numbers, because it's legitimate to track those. But tracking any given car should require a court order. The rest of us should be safe, because if the system is designed properly so that it won't see anybody that's not a suspect. It's especially dangerous for the state to know who goes where and who talks with whom. That endangers democracy. You see, democracy means that the people control what the state does. But the state has a tendency to act secretly, and then we can't control it. We have to, in order to really control it again, we need to find out what the state is doing. And that requires whistleblowers, heroes like Edward Snowden. 3 cheers for Edward Snowden. Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! But the state calls these whistleblowers criminals and tries to put them in prison. And if the state knows who goes where and who talks with whom, it can find the whistleblowers and put them in prison, and democracy cannot endure. So if we want democracy, we have to reduce the level of surveillance to the point where the state can't tell who talks with whom and who goes where. It's okay if it can track the people who courts have issued surveillance orders for, because that isn't everybody. That's only people that there's a reason to suspect. Now, the data once collected will be misused. It doesn't matter what kind of organization is collecting the data, whether it's a business or a state agency or what, because whatever data the businesses collect will be available to state agencies when they're trying to find a whistleblower. And the data can be misused by the organization that collected it. It can be misused by rogue employees of that organization. It can be stolen by crackers and then misused by them. Or it can be taken by the state, the secret police, and misused by them. So if we want to be safe, it's not sufficient to put rules on how that data is supposed to be used. That might help as long as those rules are obeyed. But as France shows, it's easy to get rid of those rules when something shocking happens that makes people panic and lose their ability to, their sense of proportion. So, if we design systems so that they don't collect data, it's much harder to overcome that. They have to change the systems in order to start collecting the data. France used to have a very efficient and honest system for protection of personal data, and it was all thrown away after one terrorist attack. And what we see is that people don't have a sense of proportion to compare dangers of different magnitudes. Terrorists have killed a few hundred people in France. Air pollution kills thousands of people in France. And the air pollution is caused by dishonest automobile manufacturers. And the European Union was looking at making the emissions tests more reliable, and last November gave up on the idea because the car manufacturers were lobbying too hard. So when it's a matter of imposing honest answers on car companies, you can't do that. But when it's a matter of denying people human rights, that's perfectly easy. It's because people are more concerned about the small danger than about the big danger. But that means they're lacking in sense of proportion. So we have to spread awareness of big and small dangers so that people won't panic and throw away human rights and democracy by accepting total surveillance. So now it's time to present my other... Well, actually, there's an article about this I should tell you about. Sorry. It's gnu.org/philosophy/surveillance-vs-democracy.html. Oh, you might want to turn the camera.
Sorry?
The camera's pointing over there. Does it still get me?
No, everything's fine.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay. That article presents these arguments and also offers many different practical and technical suggestions for how to design systems not to collect data about people or not to identify them. One part of the solution is gnu+linux, which is a system for anonymous payments that we have developed. It's anonymous for the payer, but the payee is completely identified and tracked. So it does not lend itself to tax evasion. But it does enable people to buy something anonymously from an online store. Look at taller.net for more information. And if you want to support our work, go to fsf.org and join the Free Software Foundation. If you do things online, you can do it that way. But since I'm here, you have the opportunity to fill out a card and then pay your dues in cash. So now it's time for me to present my other identity. I am Saint Ignatius of the Church of Emacs. I bless your computer, my child. Emacs started out as an extensible text editor that I wrote, which developed into a way of life for many users because they extended it so much they could do all their computing without ever leaving Emacs. And then it became a way of life, then it became a church with the launch of the newsgroup alt.religion.emacs, which you might find amusing to visit. In the Church of Emacs, we have a great schism between several versions of Emacs, and we also have saints, but no gods. Instead of gods, we adore the one true editor, Emacs. To be a member of the Church of Emacs, you must pronounce the Confession of the Faith. You must say, there is no system but GNU, and Linux is one of its kernels. Then if you become a true expert, you can celebrate that with our ceremony, the Fu Bar Mitzvah, in which which you recite a portion of our sacred scriptures, that is to say, the system source code. In the Church of Emacs, we have eliminated the priesthood of technology because everyone is welcome to read our sacred scriptures. We also have the cult of the Virgin of Emacs, which means anyone who has never used Emacs. And according to the Church of Emacs, offering someone the opportunity to lose Emacs virginity is a blessed act. We also have the Emacs pilgrimage, which consists of invoking all the commands of Emacs in alphabetical order. There is a breakaway Tibetan sect which claims that it's sufficient to invoke them automatically under the control of a script. And they do that repetitively thousands of times. But the Mother Church holds that to gain spiritual merit, you must type them by hand. The Church of Emacs has advantages compared with other churches that I won't name. For instance, to be a saint in the Church of Emacs does not require celibacy. But it does require living a life of moral purity. You must exorcise whatever demonic proprietary operating systems have possessed computers under your control or set up for your regular use, and then install a wholly free operating system, and then use and install exclusively free software with and on the system. If you make that vow and you live by it, then you too will be a saint, and you'll have the right to wear a halo, if you can find one, because they don't make them anymore. There's a traditional rivalry between Emacs and the other editor, VI. So people occasionally ask me whether in the Church of Emacs the use of VI is a sin. It's true that VI is the editor of the beast. But using a free implementation of VI is not a sin, it's a penance. A few years ago I went to China and some VI users there proposed to attack me. I was shocked, but apparently violence begins with VI. People occasionally ask whether my Halo is really an old computer disk. This is no computer disk, this is my Halo. But it was a computer disk in a previous existence. So thank you. Now it's time for the auction. This is an adorable GNU that needs a home. So I'm going to auction it for the benefit of the Free Software Foundation. If you buy it, I can sign the card for you. If you have a penguin at home, you need a GNU for your penguin. Oh, no one did it. It's just doing it spontaneously? So if you have a penguin at home, you need a GNU for your penguin. There should never be a penguin without a GNU. So we can accept payment in cash, with a bank card, or in Bitcoin if you have something here to make the payment with. Is there a bank machine somewhere near here to get cash out with?
Right out of the door.
Oh, okay, so right near here, so if you can bid as much as you feel you should, go and get the cash. I'll be here answering questions for a while. And when you bid, please wave your arm and shout the amount you're bidding as loud as you can, because I have hearing problems. You want me to hear you, right? I'm going to start with the usual price of 25 euros. Do I get 25 euros for this adorable? How much?
30?
I've got 30. Do I get 35? How much? What?
50.
50, did you say?
50, yeah.
Okay, I've got 50. Do I get 55?
56!
No, I won't. Well, I'd rather make it 55. It just avoids complications. I've got 55. Do I get 60?
60.
I've got 60. Do I get 65?
Yeah.
How much?
66.
Let's make this.
166.
Let's make this 65. Do I get 70?
70.
I've got 70. Do I get 75? How much?
75.
I've got 75. Do I get 80?
80.
I've got 80. Do I get 85?
85.
Do I get 90?
90.
I've got 90. Do I get 95?
100.
I've got 100. Do I get 110 for this adorable GNU? Do I get 110? How much?
110.
I've got 110. Do I get 120?
120.
I've got 120. Do I get 130? I've got 120. Do I get 130 for this adorable?
130.
I've got 130. Do I get 140?
140.
I've got 140. Do I get 150?
150.
I got 150. Do I get 160?
160.
I've got 160. Do I get 170? 170 for this adorable. 170 to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom. 170 or more. Last chance to bid 170 or more for this adorable GNU.
170.
I've got 170. Do I get 180?
180.
I've got 180. Do I get 190? I've got 180. Do I get 190 for this adorable GNU? 190 to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom. Last chance to bid 190 or more. How much?
290.
I've got 190.
200.
I've got 200. Do I get 220? I've got 220. Do I get 240? I've got 220. Do I get 240? 240 to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom. 240 for this adorable. I've got 220. Do I get 240? Last chance to bid 240 or more. Last chance to bid 240 or more. Going.
250.
I'm going up by. Oh wait, that's 30 more. Okay, 250. I've got 250. Do I get 275? I've got 275. Do I get 300? I've got 275. Do I get 300 for this adorable GNU? Do I get 300 to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom? 300 or more to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom. Last chance to bid 300 or more. Last chance. Going. Gone for 275.